Good. Now we are good to go.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name is Britt Currie, and I'm thinking a little bit about the role of empathy and engaging with different agents and entities. And today I will be talking about why we cannot empathize with GPT or any agents or entities lacking epistemic states, interests, and values. Um, oops. Okay. So my motivation for thinking about this. Obviously, interactions between people and AI are becoming more common, and there feels like there's some kind of relationship development going on. We also, as human beings, given our social and moral cognition, tend to empathize naturally with any agent we perceive as not only having a mind and mental states, but as having needs or having desires or goals. And while people have wondered whether LLMs can take up a human's perspective, for example, if they have a theory of mind, um, we've also been wondering similarly about why people feel attached or connected to virtual dialogic agents. So I'm not concerned about whether or not an LLM can take up our perspective, but rather the inverse, whether we can take up an LLM's perspective. And given the psychological definition of what empathy is and our best classical philosophical arguments about what empathy is supposed to entail or require, I ask, can we really empathize with agents that lack a point of view? Not that we just feel that we're empathizing with or taking up another entity or agent's perspectives, but actually asking, do our best standard accounts allow us to psychologically map on to an LLM's or, in this case, particularly ChatGPT 4's point of view? So, what is empathy according to our standard accounts? Well, empathy in general is widely characterized as the act of feeling what another feels or feeling emotionally similar. So, um, I can feel your sadness if you're feeling sad, or if you're feeling sad, even if I'm not feeling, for example, grief, I could maybe feel sad or a negatively valenced emotion towards your situation. But there's also another kind of empathy that leads to epistemic understanding, like knowing what your beliefs, desires, or goals are. So maybe I can identify or consider what it is that you believe or what you want. And in this case, I try to take up your perspective cognitively. This usually requires implicitly inferring what another agent believes or thinks. For example, if you go to grab the cup, I know that you might be thirsty, but it also requires sometimes explicit thinking. And in this case, when I talk about cognitive empathy, I'm not just talking about theory of mind. I'm going to talk about explicitly thinking about what another believes, desires, or wants to truly take up their point of view. So, what kinds of entities can we empathize with? Well, first of all, we'll start with agents that we typically empathize with. And agents we typically empathize with have some features and capacities that map onto our moral psychological framework for understanding another person's point of view, entity's point of view in the world. Usually, like you and I, epistemic states. So, usually, other agents or entities have things that they believe, that they want, and things that they know are true about the world. We tend also to empathize with agents or entities that seem to have values, like subjective preferences, like hoping that or desiring it for it to be Friday, right, rather than a Thursday. But our values also give us a tendency toward obtaining some desirable state of affairs. So, for example, if I prefer to eat eggs, I'm going to probably go to a place where they serve eggs. But other entities that we tend to empathize with also have interests. And I mean that here in a few ways. An interest is sometimes considered a right, but it's also a way that we know that we can promote another's well being or flourishing conditions. So, for example, plants might have interests, for example, to uh, go towards the sun, like a sunflower goes towards the sun. And it also has interests in being watered and growing. But we have interests and we have rights and needs that can be met. And so needs or basic things that we need or plants need, like water and sunlight, are things that we can meet for each other and other entities out there in the world. But ChatGPT clearly lacks a lot of these things. For example, it lacks emotions, which I'll argue for a little bit more in substantive ways as we go forward. It lacks typical propositional attitudes that we think compose a point of view. For example, what we believe is true of the world, what we desire, or what we want. Those are the things that make us have a perspective. For example, fictional characters can have a perspective, given that they want certain things. Um, ChatGPT also lacks interests of the kind that people and other beings tend to have. Um, there's not really needs that we can meet for ChatGPT, like relieve it of its sadness or help it perform some function that it desires to tend toward completing or doing. And it also lacks, interestingly, typical subjective or agent relative values. It doesn't have unwavering faith in a particular God. It doesn't love its family in particular, but it also lacks typical objective values. So, for example, there's nothing it's like for ChatGPT to think that freedom is a good value to hold or that peace would be a good value to obtain in general, even for the population at large. And that's going to become clearer as I talk about the fact that it doesn't have any propositional attitudes. So, given these deficits or features or capacities that we generally think that agents or entities that we empathize with tend to have, I'm going to say we cannot empathize with GPT, at least on our orthodox psychological and philosophical accounts of empathy, because that's the goal of the argument here. So, if our classical philosophical and psychological accounts of empathy can't categorize our interactions with GPT as empathetic in kind, we have two choices. We revise our existing accounts of empathy to include perspective taking with GPT, perhaps engaging in some kind of conceptual engineering, maybe change our definition of empathy, or maybe we want to include the phenomena of perspective taking with things that lack these features or capacities. And so we'll revise our existing accounts of empathy. Or we reject that we can empathize with GPT or agents of the like kind. Um, just in case they fail to meet the conditions of our best theories. So I'm going to show three accounts that I take to be paradigmatic in the literature, both philosophically and psychologically, of what empathy is. The emotional empathy account, the subjective values account, the cognitive empathy account. I show that they all fail to explain how it is or how we could empathize with an entity like GPT. Um, and I conclude that we cannot empathize with GPT on our standard accounts because it lacks interest values and epistemic states, which all three accounts require. And an interesting consequence that arises as a result of this argument that I won't have time to go into deeply, but I hope to in the future, is showing that when taking these three arguments together, we demonstrate that GPT, in fact, has no substantive point of view to empathize with. So, the first standard account of empathy, or what empathy is the emotion centric account, the idea that we have to feel what another feels to empathize with that entity or agent. So, empathizing on standard emotional accounts requires some agent A has emotions, we feel similarly, or at least we emotionally regard what that agent is feeling, or even just identify what that agent is feeling. So if ChatGPT has emotional states, we can empathize with it, but it doesn't, therefore, we can't empathize with it. Some of the motivations from this come from Bailey's 2022 and the evolutionary psychologist Day Wall that make, at least at the very core of it, emotion the central point of what it means to empathize. This is because there are practical considerations and psychological considerations. Emotions urge us to care in the moment about our care in the moment, and they also show our innate and learned emotional responses to others, and they ground our capacity to perspective take with others. It's supposed to provide us with intrinsic motivation to help others meet their goals. So if I see someone suffering, I want to relieve them of that suffering, and feeling that in me gives me the motivation to go forward and do so. But GPT as a system or agent lacks robust concepts of emotions that could support emotionally based empathy. Obviously, it lacks emotionally relevant evaluative states. So, for example, Emotional experiences are usually labeled as negative or positive. There's nothing it's like for GPT to think of sadness as a negative or positive thing. It lacks, obviously, phenomenology and embodied feelings, given it lacks physical substrates or the hardware to feel what it's like or realize emotions in the way we typically tend to understand them. And it also lacks what I think is required, which is a robust conceptual understanding of what emotions are. So, given this is true, there's nothing it's like for us to imagine GPT feeling or preferring to be loved or treated in a way that would cause it to have related preferences. So, it doesn't avoid things that makes it sad. It doesn't aim towards things that make it content. And since we cannot entertain GPT having feelings that constitute a way it stands in relation to each other, namely, this coffee makes me happy, such as a feeling of love, compassion. We can't empathize with GPT in the sense that we know it just can't experience or instantiate these kinds of mental states. But maybe we can empathize with GPT on epistemic grounds. Perhaps it has some point of view that is composed of beliefs, desires, or knowledge about the world. But DeWalt argues on the evolutionary count that the core of empathizing is fundamentally emotional. He says cognitive empathy or epistemic empathy makes it possible to furnish targeted help that takes specific needs of others into account. So, cognitive empathy goes beyond feeling what another person feels, but it would be hard to explain why we would do that without the motivation provided by the emotional component of feeling what the other feels. And so, without emotion, we can't connect to other agents that either lack emotion or cannot experience it themselves. So we can't empathize with GPT on the standard emotional count. But what about non emotional kinds of empathy? Well, we all care about things in unique ways. We share universal values in the sense that we share concepts about freedom, family, and hope. But then we also have particular subjective values. So, for example, there's a way that you care about your family, and that's unique probably from the way that I care about my family or from the way that I prioritize or care about my family. There's something it's like for me to care about my family in general. So I'm going to use L.A. Paul's values account to talk about why it is that if empathizing is valuing what another values in the subjective way that they value it, it turns out we can't do that with GPT. So empathizing requires understanding what another values in the way that they value it, not that Sarah just cares about her family, but the way she cares about her family in particular. So there's something GPT must value in particular, but there's nothing that GPT values in particular, so we can't empathize with ChatGPT. Um, Typical agents we empathize with also have goals and choices that align with their values. So, for example, typical agents we empathize with have either real goals or at least conceivable goals we can imagine. For example, in the case of fictional characters, they have potentially set dispositions and traits, even if dynamic, and we can imagine that they desire for some states of affairs to attain given their background beliefs and the rules of the world. But since ChatGPT doesn't have a model of the world and it doesn't have a set of fixed dispositions or traits, that rules GPT out in that way. It's possible also to know that even if we have some set of values or we have some particular set of flourishing conditions, something it's like for us to realize our best lives, we could also act contrary to our flourishing conditions. And even if most rational agents would agree that some set of objective conditions would be good for me, like eating healthy or getting enough sleep, it's possible for me to not do those things. And it's also possible for me to act contrary to my own subjective preferences. So there's a lot of text on the slide, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. But so let's just say for any agent that I cognitively perspective take with, there's something it's like for me to understand the kind of relative weights they assign to their own individual values. Maybe they really care about their family or they really care about completing their dissertation. Can we do this with GPT? It seems intuitive. GPT doesn't have agent relative values. It can't desire anything contrary to its function or independent of me prompting it or querying it. It can err and it can hallucinate, but it can't make mistakes about, oops, I need to go back. How do I do that? How do I go back? Um, oh yeah. So there's nothing it's like for it to make a mistake about reaching its intended goal. It can't desire anything outside of what would be good for it in terms of its flourishing conditions. And it doesn't have any particular sense of relational concepts. For example, it probably lacks understanding of justice, for example, since that's a relation between me and the world or society and some state of affairs attaining. And since it can't engage in relational reasoning, there's nothing it's like to understand what is just or right. GPT also doesn't explore things for the sake of curiosity. It doesn't try things for the sake of learning. It doesn't take chances. It doesn't have spontaneity or autonomy. And in many cases, we think that agents who act on their preferences act so autonomously and evaluate possible outcomes, and GPT doesn't do that at all. But perhaps GPT has some other kinds of epistemic states that are just kind of weird, and I'm mischaracterizing what it means to be able to take an attitude up toward the world. And so maybe there's a way we can operationalize what it would mean to have an epistemic perspective in the non-usual sense. Um, so in this case, ChatGPT, I'm going to argue, has no substantive beliefs about the world or itself, given it has no semantic evaluation of any sentence. It doesn't represent it as a proposition that it outputs. So I can't empathize with GPT on the basis that I either share or understand its beliefs. We know a propositional attitude's a mental state an agent or person takes towards a proposition, a statement that could be true or false. So if I say it's raining, that's either true or false. And then I take an attitude toward that proposition. I either believe that it's raining or I don't. And I could be wrong about it or I could be correct. When we want to know what a person's perspective is on whether or not it's raining or how they perceive the world, we want to know not just whether or not it's true or false that it's raining, but additionally what they believe to be true. And to do this, we engage in cognitive empathy, which is the mechanism for understanding by either directly referring what another is thinking or explicitly identifying what the other person is thinking, feeling, believing, or desiring. Um, Whether we define cognitive empathy as approving of another person's epistemic point of view, namely that it maps onto the world in some true way, or evaluating what they believe, think, and know, we can't empathize with GPT on the grounds that it completely lacks an epistemic life. Um, but it seems like ChatGPT is pretty good at outputting or reporting things that are generally true about a perspective on the world or generally represent a perspective or point of view that a person could adopt. So, for example, it might be able to predict how we could respond to a false belief task, but GPT itself fails at more complicated social reasoning tasks for important reasons. So, for example, take the bank case. Linda's a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, very bright person. She majored in philosophy. She's deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Um, in this case, we can think about like the bank teller and philosophy case. Um, Linda's a bank teller and also philosopher. Is she a feminist? Most people would say yes. And ChatGPT would probably say yes. But human beings make these assumptions based on background beliefs about what features or qualities feminists have. And so we make mistakes based on our background beliefs and biases. But GPT doesn't make errors in the same kind of way. Um, what we take, it doesn't make an error based on the relevant kind of epistemic evidence. So while upon reflection, we can understand that we're engaging in base rate neglect or that we're operating on social norms that guide us in the wrong direction. GPT is not related to the evidence in those right kinds of ways. And for the sake of argument, I'll just say maybe it has dispositional beliefs and something has a dispositional belief just in case each time we query it, it turns out that it holds that belief. So GPT can report to us consistently and accurately that the capital of France is Paris. But according to Schwitzgebel, just finding out or responding in the same way each time we're queried about whether or not something is true does not entail we have a dispositional belief. For example, to really fully believe that women are intellectually equal requires more than simply being ready to say that women are intellectually capable. Rather, we have to be willing to act on that, update our background beliefs, and have other thoughts and actions that align with that background belief. Reporting or responding the same way each time is queried is not enough to demonstrate that GPT holds some kind of dispositional belief or background belief about the world. So any agent or system would have to further act on or demonstrate an ability to, an entire network of beliefs and other facts it knows about the world, demonstrate that it's prepared to act on the fact that it thinks that women are intellectually capable. I'm running out of time. Yeah, so maybe we can go to questions, and uh, I'll end with, when querying GPT, we seek answers. This kind of conversational style inquiry models our engagement with our epistemic peers. We ask questions, generate ideas, and reason together through conversation. And through collaborative inquiry, we gain a deeper understanding of the world and other subjective values and personal aims. But with GPT, while we might learn something new about the world, we don't learn anything new about GPT itself. And therefore, we cannot empathize with GPT.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Round of applause for you. And now let's hear the questions. Yes, sure. We invite you here near the microphone.
Hello, first of all, thank you for your presentation. Yeah, just to make things clear, can you agree or disagree that we can empathize fictional characters, or, for example, when the children, can they empathize their, for example, their dolls with their inner peace? Can we empathize them?
So I'd say in the first case, with respect to fictional characters, absolutely. In this case, there is a conceivable set of beliefs, desires, and ways of being in the world that we could imagine of taking. There's something it's like for Harry Potter, right? To have knowledge of magic or beliefs about the world that he lives in. And those are set dispositions and fixed traits that are dynamic. So there's something conceivably that it's like to take up its point of view. But since at base, ChatGPT doesn't believe anything, and doesn't have any model of the world, there's nothing it's like to think it has a perspective on the world that it's engaging with, and nothing it's like to think that it has beliefs, desires, or goals with respect to the world that it's situated in.
Yeah, sorry, but do you know Getier's cases about knowledge?
Yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, but don't you think that we have the same problems here, that true desire belief, it's very necessary, but it's not enough to make something, to contribute something as empathy? And if we have the same thing while we're trying to empathy, like those of the fiction characters, why we could tell the same about AI, about ChatGPT, chatbots, like, and these systems? Because it looks like we have very necessary characteristics, but it's still but still not enough. Don't you think
Good.
so?
Good, yeah. So there might be something it's like for me in like this, if you look at like Shanahan's paper on like what role playing is, within the context window of GPT, I might tell it to behave like a character with a certain subset of dispositions. And then it can go on to do that for a little bit of time. And then it kind of loses that ability. And when that happens, my schema of tracking its fictional state sort of breaks down as soon as that character breaks down. So there's something it's like for that to dissolve. It might be possible to engage with chatbots that have like a fixed set of traits or a fixed set of dispositions and characteristics. But it doesn't seem like, at least GPT without interfacing with other kinds of programs or extensions, that there's anything it's like for it to hold on to those kinds of fixed traits or dispositions in a way in which we would be able to attribute it a set of fixed states or understanding of the world. All it's doing is sort of looking at the likely co-occurrence between two words and generating the most probabilistic thing that comes next. So there's nothing it's like for it to, to truly have a commitment to a proposition that is conceivable to us. Whereas in the case with fictional characters, there is, and we could be wrong about somebody's point of view, right? But there's nothing it's like to be wrong about GPT's perspective because it has none.
Yeah, okay, thank you for the answer, honestly. Yeah, totally.
Okay, so we have one more question here.
Hi, congrats for your talk. So I just have a couple of questions. So it seems that empathy has to be based on our ability to imagine there is something it is like for the target towards we would feel empathy for, right? But if to build upon the previous question, it seems that children have this tendency to ascribe mental states, and therefore they can imagine there might be something it is like for dolls to be experiencing something. And some people, while going through grief, they can imagine there is something it is like for the dead person to be experiencing. And so I'm thinking about such cases in which actually there are no mental states because the person is dead, right? And we're talking about dolls, obviously, no mental states there. So perhaps feeling empathy towards someone has more to do with our ability to imagine the other person as being capable to have mental states, but it's not like based on any sort of information we have about this cognitive architecture. I think there's a tendency in small young children to do that to non-human entities such as dolls or non-human animals and the like. And I think that people who score really high on empathy scales also seem to have this tendency to ascribe mental states to or emotional states to people who are known to not be experiencing them, such as, I don't know, perhaps serial killers or I don't know. So I was wondering what you think about those cases. And then another example that I had in mind is, I don't know if you've ever seen those videos in which some people just play with robots. And at some point, someone starts hitting a robot, right? And it seems that the people who are watching the videos tend to, based on their comments, they seem to empathize with the robot, although they are aware of the fact that the robot has no mental state. So it's right. It seems that in those cases, ascribing or feeling empathy towards someone, there's or depends on our ability to imagine some sort of sameness with the other. So, what was your view with regards to those particular examples?
Yeah, those were fantastic examples. I think that they're really interesting, and I've thought a little bit about them. So I definitely think that we could empathize with the dead because there's something that not only it was like for us to imagine that they would want were they were here. It's not uncommon also for us to think about the things they would say if they were here. Now, we could also imagine that they're the kinds of entities that could have interests were they here, that did have interests when they were here. I also think that children do tend to ascribe not only animacy and agency to things that don't have it, but it is imagination and play is really important for developing, empathetic skills. What I think is really interesting is that for the child with the doll, there is a sense in which there's something it's like for that child to imagine a fixed set of traits that it's projecting onto the doll, that the doll could feel were it real, that it has needs that it could meet were it a real were the doll to become real. And I think that those kinds of imaginations, those imaginative plays are interesting things to think about. I think my idea with the GPT is that there's something it's like, though, for its schema of interaction with us to break down over time as its working memory context sorts to devolve. When that happens, our mental schema of tracking its mental state starts to break down. When that happens with the doll, it's sort of like, well, okay, I just keep attributing new ideas, beliefs, ways that it could be in the world. I've sort of created a set of like normative rules and play rules that happen like in that world. But I think there's something really uncanny that happens with GPT as it starts to lose its context window, where we start to realize that's not the same agent I was just tracking. That's not the thing that just seemed to believe this thing 5 seconds ago. Why is that? And I think that is that context breakdown that makes it different, particularly from the imagination case with the doll and the empathizing with the dead case, which I do think are cases of empathizing. So it's that context window breaking down for me, I think. And other chatbots may go on to have that more long term. And when that's true, I think that's a different argument where I might have to concede that we do.
Yeah, you're right. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Tina?
Okay, thank you for your answers. We have one more question here.
Hi. Yeah, I think I have to switch. Okay. So I really like the presentation. It was really nicely laid out. However, I had a difficult time thinking about your point of view criterion when talking about ChatGPT, and that fictional characters have a point of view and ChatGPT does not. An author might conceive a fictional character of a person or person-like figure, right, with some traits and how it would react and behave in said context. However, a LLM programmer would do a similar thing using probabilistic nets. Why would that be an issue, and the person wouldn't recognize GPT as having a point of view? And with that inconsistency in communication, I said earlier that each and every time you talk with GPT would seem like talking with a different agent. What if that didn't happen? Would we, okay, we maybe would have some sort of short memory added to programmed. Would we still will we still recognize a point of view in that reimagined GPT?
I mean, yeah, that's a really good question, right? So if it could be the case that GPT just didn't look at the likely co-occurrence between two terms to predict the next likely word, and rather it had a subset of sentences that it believed or valued as true, or it adopted as being more likely to be the next thing that comes up in the sequence. And we're looking at entire propositions rather than, say, some subset or string of words. Then it might be the case that it looks like now it has something more like propositional attitudes and dispositions to think that one thing is true over another. As I understood it, it kind of seems like, for me, like fictional characters, there's something it's like for it to be true that the fake doll that I'm holding is hungry, right? But it seems like when GPT says that care is something that human beings prefer, it's not operating on the same kind of epistemic logic because it's not hooked up to the same evidence in the right way. Yeah, I think if we had agents that had a set of sentences that it was committed to as either true or false, then I think we're looking at a different agent. And I think with that kind of agent, yeah, it might have a point of view.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. If there is no other question here in the room and neither online, then I have one question. My question is simple. How do we know that ChatGPT has no emotions, has no internal model of the world? How can we be sure of this? So sure.
That's a really good question. We tend to think that being hooked up to the world in a way that depends on evidence requires us to have certain features of our, let's say, computational profile or psychological profile that shows that when the world changes, like I'm able to respond. It seems to me like understanding where words are located in vector space and making a connection between those things is an understanding about how definitions between words relate or how categories between words may relate. But that doesn't really give me knowledge of the fact that it doesn't really give me an understanding of the world writ large. So, for example, I don't know what it means for somebody to care about the world just because I know that care is a term that often shows up as a positive emotion. I don't think that GPT is able to make causal inferences because looking at the likely correlation between words in vector space doesn't allow it to engage in a causal narrative of if A, then B, then C. In terms of emotions, I think I tried to give somewhat of an argument that usually we think it's something like being able to evaluate some state of affairs as negative or positive. Doesn't look like GPT can valence states of affairs in the world as negative or positive. It also doesn't look like, as of yet, it has the kind of computational ability to prefer one thing over another or tend towards one thing over another that it thinks is preferable or preferable. If it does have something like emotions, let's call them emotion star, if it does have something like beliefs, whatever the most minimalist form of belief is, then I guess I would need to understand further how it is that what GPT does when it considers states of affairs that we query it about. Given how it currently operates, like I guess I would just need to know what the person would think emotions are if they're not how we tend to characterize them, and what beliefs are if they're not what we think they are, how we tend to characterize them. So I guess my question for you, or my answer for you, is really thin in the sense that outside of the arguments that I've given, I guess I don't know. And so maybe it does.
Yeah, maybe we don't know that. That's right. Well, I was so curious during our discussion today, and also about the analogy with fictional characters, because we know for sure that they do not experience emotion, but still we can imagine that they can, right? So I asked my ChatGPT. My question to ChatGPT like this. I'm wondering if you experience any emotion. And the answer is, I don't experience them in the way you do. I don't have feelings, body or subject awareness, but I can recognize emotional patterns in language and respond in ways that mimic emotional understanding. Kind of like fictional characters do, right?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about interactive fictional characters like versus static ones that might be like in our social imagination or like in the text, right? Um, I think that I think this goes back to the role playing paper. I do think that we can role play with ChatGPT, but I'm not sure that role playing with ChatGPT is the same as empathizing with it, because I think that in the sense that I'm assigning it the role, there's something it's like for me to know that I'm projecting that role onto it, right? And that it's not necessarily static or fixed outside of what I'm doing. But then I think that it begs the question of, well, we just said in the imaginary case with the doll that that's true, that I can project states of affairs onto it and come up with rules for how to interact with it, and that would count as empathizing. Um, so maybe it's the case that if ChatGPT just had a really long context window and it could uh, role play with me in that way forever, then maybe I'd have to admit that we were empathizing with ChatGPT.
Okay, okay. I can see the difference you're making in here. Also, I remember that you mentioned, or someone mentioned before, that each time we talk with ChatGPT is like engaging in conversation with some other agent. Actually, I'm not sure about that because you know there have been days since I last talked with my ChatGPT. So today I'm coming back. Hi. And the answer is, hi, Gina, I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How about you? How's your research going on? So it's not another agent. It remembers our past conversations.
Yeah, there does seem to be something that it's like, right, for it to refer back to our past conversations. And I wonder, I guess I do wonder, like, the more that it's able to reference our past conversations, is it updating on knowing that that's true about you? Is there something it's like for it to believe or desire for your research to go well? That's an interesting question. I'm not sure that that's the case. However, as its traits or dispositions or what it seems to remember about us becomes more static, then perhaps there's going to be something more that it's like for it to develop some kind of point of view on the world. Certainly, it seems to be having a point of view about you. But I wonder if knowing some set of facts about you or knowing some things about you is equivalent to it understanding your point of view, which I think is a different question.
Well, here I totally agree with you. I think it's not about understanding actually, and it's not about even remembering. It's about the way it's been programmed by its programmer. So it's about the understanding and the intelligence and the emotional states and everything that the programmer put into it. Actually, it's reflecting back our own human emotions, human understanding, and so on. And the fact that we are questioning ourselves about all this discussion we had today and we will continue tomorrow is just because well, the hidden layers, which for the moment we cannot explain to ourselves how they work, they give us this kind of fuzzy understanding, but it's only the programmer behind in here. That's all. Okay. If any other questions, because we are 10 minutes over our time slot. But it was fun. Yeah, but our discussion was so interesting, so that's why we allowed for this to happen. Thank you very much. Thank you once again.
Thank you,
Very
everyone. That was
engaging
fantastic.
discussion.
Thank you.
Okay. We have some